They asked for a whole lot of improvements in the regulatory system, uh, but those clearly haven't happened yet, as we'll see in the case of GM mustard. In GM mustard as well, in 2015, there was a proposal received by Center to approve GM mustard. Now, this is resistant to glufosinate. Glufosinate is an even more problematic herbicide than glyphosate, for which Bayer is paying those billions of dollars of fine in US. And obviously, glyphosate is allowed to be used in India. It is being used illegally in the case of herbicide tolerant cotton. And the situation in mustard, the story that was concocted was that it will help reduce import dependence on oil seeds. Now, clearly, the import dependence on oil seeds is a major issue. We are importing more than over 1 lakh crore worth of edible oil in India every year. However, there are other mechanisms of being able to tackle this import dependency.
Rohit Parakji, who has been working on food and agriculture systems after his return from living and working in corporate life in the UK. His primary area of work is on transitioning to and scaling of organic or natural farming and on strengthening safe and nutritious food systems through national level networks. He has also been working to tackle threats to these as well. I welcome you, sir, and I request you to take over from here.
Thank you. Namaste, everyone. I'll start the presentation by speaking about seeds and as they have been in India traditionally. Now, given genetic modification is done on seeds in the case of Indian agriculture, I thought it'll be good to just touch on what has been the drishti and perspective on seeds in India. And there have been numerous shastras which have spoken about them, including and beyond Vriksha Ayurved, Arthashastra, Krishi Parashar, Brihad Jataka. There have been a lot of oral traditions, a lot of songs on it. A lot of them have been disappearing, unfortunately, over time. But yeah, these have been traditions which have lasted on for centuries, where through which a whole lot of information about seeds has been conveyed beyond the Shastras as well. And they have been conveying and covering aspects on a whole lot of aspects of seeds. The point of mentioning all of this is that there has been a whole lot of science and technology around Indian agriculture, obviously, but also seeds as well. Techniques such as plant mutagenesis have been mentioned in our texts earlier on as well, which are techniques on helping uh, build and identify certain variations in seed. So through either physical or chemical techniques in terms of mutations. So, and obviously we've had a whole range of traditional seed varieties. We've had varieties for a whole lot of health conditions, for pregnant women, for tackling cancer, for many other health issues. Uh, you know, they've been mentioned in Ayurveda. Charkha, Sushruta both covered those on a whole lot of traditional rice varieties. Even in the context of the current changing climatic conditions, there are still varieties which have been tolerant to drought, salinity, floods. And these are actually some of the reasons for which GM seed varieties are being mentioned on spoken about, that they will help in with drought tolerance, they will help with salinity, they will help with flood tolerance, they will help in providing additional nutrition. Golden rice is supposed to be a variety which is supposed to provide additional nutrition. Why are we not able to look at our traditional varieties which already provide a whole lot of these and much more without any of the risks that are associated with genetically modified seeds? Is a question worth pondering on upon. Is looking at our traditional varieties regressive, backward? We always have to ignore them and move ahead and explore something which, as we will see, carries with a whole lot of risks and issues with itself. Um, when we look at GMO, a genetically modified organism, the definition as stated by WHO as well, it is basically something in which the DNA has been altered in a way which does not occur by nature. This is something that is, that one is tampering with in a manner which nature does not allow for it to be done. What I'll also be covering over the next few slides is going through the history of GM in India, in the Indian agriculture and food systems. Now, and we'll start with cotton because that is the only crop which has been legally allowed to be genetically modified in India. Now, yeah, the issues with cotton started long back. Even pre-independence, there had been a move away from desi cotton to American cotton. But still, I mean, the British didn't manage to completely change that. But the intention was to move towards American cotton, which is more suited toward that push continue actually picked much more greater traction post-independence. And the idea was to move away from crops like cotton, which were not grown in a monoculture pattern as they are today. They were grown with other crops as well. The benefit of having mixed cropping is not just that it will provide food for farmers. It will help them protected from conditions if there is crop loss in one crop or so on. These also are time and tested mechanisms of natural and organic farming, where such multi-cropping, mixed cropping help in dealing with pests as well. And yeah, the move to American cotton led to increasing pest attacks on cotton as well. And so it's not that pre-BT cotton, the cotton farmers were actually in a very good condition. They were facing those pest attacks on American cotton anyways, and on the monoculture cropping conditions. And so supposedly to deal with this is where the story of the BT cotton actually came into being. And as we will see, a whole lot of GM crops have started in India with smuggling, with illegal cultivation. And the farmers on whom they were sold the story that such illegal GM cotton cultivation would be beneficial, they adopted it. And with the adoption came a whole lot of things which we'll see shortly. Now, and with that, in a few years' time, in 2002, BT cotton, with its illegal cultivation, it was legalized. And what they also started to do, and they all, the GM industry always asks the questions, well, we didn't actually impose it on farmers. Farmers themselves chose to adopt it. But what they don't mention is that the non-GM cotton varieties were started to be removed from market. Now, BT cotton is, BT stands for Bacillus thuringiensis, which is basically a soil bacteria. Now, the theory is that this will actually help in protecting plants from some pests. However, the story the result was entirely different, as we'll see shortly. Now, again, there were a whole lot of promotion advertisements done. There was ads of Nana Patekar where he was promising, higher savings, greater yield. There were a whole lot of other television advertisements which spoke about lower pesticide usage. There were also a very interesting story in terms of how our desi cotton varieties, germplasm, they were either removed from market or the germplasm was destroyed. Germplasm, which has been in existence for millennia, it was destroyed, and these are the conditions under which GM cotton actually became, widespread mainstream. The textile industry, also the mill industry also wanted a reduction in cotton varieties in the late 90s, so that they could actually their processing units could handle the diversity in staple length of cotton much easier. If you look at BT cotton, and it's been more than 20 years since its cultivation started, the data and the results speak for themselves. The pesticide usage has increased. It has become resistant to other pests which were not that mainstream. Pink bollworm has become a major issue in cotton. Fertilizer usage for BT cotton has increased, as it was predicted that it would, because it is a hybrid BT cotton, and hybrids do need greater fertilizer usage. The cost of seeds to farmers have gone up drastically. In 2018, 6 years ago, it was anticipated that the royalty costs from BT cotton for Monsanto, just the royalty cost, leave aside the additional cost which other companies, the other income that they were making, was 8,000 crores. There are numerous studies which have spoken about how cost of cultivation. There are government reports which speak about how cost of cultivation has gone up for farmers. There has been greater indebtedness. It has also been seen that these are the systems and parameters under which there have been greater suicide of farmers in geographies where BT cotton has been widespread as well. the yields have actually started to decline. It was promised that the yields would go up. However, what was seen was that the increase in yield, which was continuing from before the time BT cotton came into mainstream, it was increasing then. However, when BT cotton actually became mainstream, when it acquired 40%, from there on the yield stagnated, and now they're actually declining. But they used it to portray the story that even in the initial years, BT cotton actually had a greater yield, whereas its percentage was minuscule when the yield was actually growing. And there have been research by acclaimed scientists who have mentioned that it was not BT cotton; it was actually the increase in fertilizer usage, it was increase in irrigation, which was leading to an increase in yield in cotton even before the years BT cotton came mainstream. And rather than looking at the full data set, the proponents of GM cotton have all time and again looked at a small data set of farmers to show that these farmers actually benefited. And they time and again hide from referring to the full data census and taking a very small proportion of farmer to mislead people. And just in the last year, we have actually seen Rajasthan government had to put a relief fund of over 1,000 crore because of the loss to BT cotton by pest attacks. Similarly, Punjab, Haryana, huge losses have gone to farmers. Now, who's going to actually pay the government for that? I mean, why are the promoters of GM cotton not held accountable for the losses that are being incurred by the farmers, by the government? And it was actually predicted that these things will happen. There were voices which were mentioning at that time as well that there are going to be issues with this. There have been government reports where they've mentioned in terms of how farmers have been making huge losses on BT cotton as well. Even beekeepers reported how honeybees started staying away from BT cotton crops. Now, BT cotton is supposed to, not be entering our food supply chain. However, the cotton seed oil is actually being sold to consumers, which is basically genetically modified cotton seed oil, which is illegally entering our food supply chain. The insecticides which are also being used in BT cotton are entering our food supply chain as well. And obviously, we do know that most of the countries who have a higher yield than India in cotton do not use GM cotton as well. So that's been the story of cotton in a gist. I'll then speak about. I referred earlier on how BT cotton was brought in illegally. I'll also talk about some of the other illegal GM crop cultivations which have been pushed in India, which have already been known to be grown. Now, in 2009, there was something called as herbicide tolerant cotton. Now, 99% of genetically modified crops in India have been either in the world have been either BT or HT, herbicide tolerant, or a combination of both. Now, the idea of herbicide tolerant is that when weeds, as they're known, when they are growing in crops, one can use herbicides, weedicides, which are quite problematic chemicals such as glyphosate, glufosinate, uh, and glyphosate is the same chemical for which in US the company, Monsanto, which is now been bought by Bayer, have been paying billions of dollars in fine for glyphosate because they didn't tell people about the cancer risks associated with glyphosate. Now, in 2009, it was reported to the government that herbicide tolerant cotton has been identified to be illegally cultivated, and we are at 15 years since then. No strong, serious action has been yet taken to stop uh, herbicide tolerant cotton. There have been numerous suggestions which have been mentioned in terms of what should be taken to stop and tackle the origin of the smuggling of these seeds. Rather superficially, one has seen some action, but no serious action yet. And these herbicide tolerant crops are being incentivized so that this will reduce the labor costs and encourage farmers to use these chemicals to kill the weeds. I mean, as of this year, it is estimated that roughly around 20% of cotton in India is now herbicide tolerant cotton. Again, the same tactic of ensuring that of allowing the illegal cultivation to increase to such a level that one is not able to stop them at all. And this is the narrative, and companies are now pushing that given such a large scale is already happening, we might as well as get the approval anyways. There was interestingly an investigation taking place on international seed companies pushing this illegal cultivation of herbicide tolerant cotton a few years ago. But since the report came and then there was some brouhaha which was created, since then there has been no any further update on the investigation which is taking place by intelligence departments in the country on what happened to that. Similarly, and cotton is not the only crop in food crops as well. In GM soybean, in BT brinjal, GM soybean in 2017 in Gujarat, it was found to be cultivated illegally. That particular place where it was being cultivated, that was managed. Similarly, in Haryana in 2019, GM brinjal, genetically modified brinjal, BT brinjal, was found to be cultivated illegally. That particular farm where it was being cultivated, that was managed. The crop was destroyed there, but the seed supply chain, from where those seeds came, how many other places, which will help in actually finding out how many other places this might be cultivated at, no action was taken in there. Similarly, in 2021, an export and consignment of an Indian company was recalled because genetically modified ingredient was found in the rice flour. And a whole lot of companies, especially in Europe, whole lot of countries do not allow for GM crops. Now, with such threats to the farmers, with such threats to the economy in the form of losses to the companies in exports, there hasn't been any serious action yet on the illegal cultivation of GM crops, the route through which they've been able to push BT cotton. Now, whilst I covered the mechanisms of trying to promote things illegally, there have been also cases where such GM crops have been attempted to be brought legally as well. And brinjal was the first one. So roughly 20 years ago, I mean, it was known that BT brinjal approval might be happening, and a whole lot of people who had learned from the situation and the issues in BT cotton, they were concerned about this. And since then, in 2009, when the approval for large scale cultivation of BT brinjal was given, and there has been constant US pressure from that time to even today to get GM crops being pushed in India. And they don't do this just in India, they do this around the world. However, there were a whole lot of things which were found in the BT brinjal regulatory process, some of which were repeated later on as well. There were a whole lot of important tests which were not performed to assess BT brinjal safety. There were those who actually had conflict of interest, who were regulators as well, who actually stood to gain from GM crops, who were in the regulatory body, which is the GAC in the Ministry of Environment. The studies have been continued to be done by GM promoters themselves. The regulators who should be doing independent studies have not been doing independent studies, and it is the same as where if I were to give an exam, I would make my own question paper. I would fill it myself. I would give myself the marks, and I would give the summary result of the marks in various sections to the teachers. That's a good summary of how the GM regulation in India has been about. There were, the Indian National Science Academy, 6 academies of those which are supposed to be the topmost bodies. They actually signed off a plagiarized report to support BT Brinjal. Such has been the standard of science in Indian regulatory bodies, and all of this is on record. Similarly, when the Supreme Court actually, and they had set up a technical expert committee to actually study the biosafety dossiers, which again were provided by the promoters, not based on independent studies, they actually saw health impact on cows and rats who consumed BT cotton and BT brinjal. Now, often the promoters of GM crops, they would say, what is the health impact on all those people who have been consuming it? Well, to actually be able to perform the health impact in US, for instance, where labeling was not allowed to go ahead for the longest period of time, and one has seen a whole lot of health parameters being impacted in the time frame where GM crops came in US. But obviously, one cannot prove whether it is just correlation or causation, whether it happened, because of other reasons, or whether GM crops were behind it. Similarly, when one actually tested it on animals in India, and this was again done by the companies themselves, not independent testing, cows who were actually consuming those crops, they showed reduction in milk yield. They were there were indication that they were giving lesser milk than they were before they consumed GM crops. Now one can only imagine what will be the case for humans who would be consuming cotton seed oil illegally. Rats, when they were consuming the GM crops, their blood parameters, their organ sizes, they changed after consuming them. Now, again, and with a whole lot of other such issues, the promoters themselves tried to hide it, saying this was, this was statistically insignificant. This should not. And there were a whole lot of gaps pointed in the Supreme Court's technical expert committee, which showed that there were many issues, studies which were done by the promoters themselves. State governments, after state government, they rejected BT Brinjal, and this was, in 2009-10, union government was trying to push it, but then they rejected BT Brinjal. A wide section of society opposed BT Brinjal. Scientists, you name it, and there was opposition from people. And now, interestingly, the BT Brinjal was taken to Bangladesh, which has a weaker regulatory system than even in India, and there have been numerous reports of those BT Brinjal being smuggled back to India as well. And the approval in Bangladesh is now being actually also being used as a mechanism in terms of trying to push. If Bangladesh is approving it, why are you not approving BT Brinjal as well? So this was the first food crop which was tried, where legal cultivation was tried. The second, and again, after this, when the Supreme Court Technical Expert Committee actually looked at it, they saw that there are a whole lot of issues, and that obviously, BT Brinjal and a whole lot of other GM crops should not be allowed to go ahead. They asked for a whole lot of improvements in the regulatory system, uh, but those clearly haven't happened yet, as we'll see in the case of GM mustard. In GM mustard as well, in 2015, there was a proposal received by Center to approve GM mustard. Now, this is resistant to glufosinate. Glufosinate is an even more problematic herbicide than glyphosate, for which Bayer is paying those billions of dollars of fine in US. And obviously, glyphosate is allowed to be used in India. It is being used illegally in the case of herbicide tolerant cotton. And the situation in mustard, the story that was concocted was that it will help reduce import dependence on oil seeds. Now, clearly, the import dependence on oil seeds is a major issue. We are importing more than over 1 lakh crore worth of edible oil in India every year. However, there are other mechanisms of being able to tackle this import dependency, which we'll cover later. Now, again, if one looks at the regulatory process which was followed for this, they fudged the data, they manipulated the data to show higher yields. The data actually did not have the yields that they were mentioning. The biosafety, one of the lessons that they learned after the biosafety dossier of BT Brinjal and BT cotton was analyzed and scrutinized, and they were found to have a lot of gaps. They did not put the biosafety dossier of BT Brinjal in public. The chief information commissioner asked, the court asked for it, but they said, they just refused to put it out in public for independent scrutiny by scientists. The comparison of yield to actually suggest that GM mustard was a higher yielding variety, it was deliberately done with lower yielding varieties, whereas we had and we still have higher yielding varieties than even the fudge data that they mentioned. They did not compare it with higher yielding available varieties at that point of time. The same conflict of interest that we were speaking about earlier, the co-developer of GM mustard himself was a regulator at one point of time. Again, key tests were not done, health experts were not involved in the process. Again, the same thing of, the developers themselves doing their own tests. And if one looks at the IP trail on the technology, the intellectual property trail, it actually leads to Bayer. However, this is actually being projected as a Swadeshi GM crop, whereas in reality, this seems to be a Trojan crop to allow for one GM crop, and then after one that, in the food crop, and leading to a whole lot of other GM crops after that. Again, there was the opposition from state governments. The same state, in obviously 2015 or 2016, BJP had been in power. There were BJP state governments who were actually opposing GM mustard as well. There were many other stakeholders who were also opposing GM mustard. It was put in cold storage then. Again, it has been revived. The proposal to push for the same GM mustard has again been revived. Now, again, in terms of the opposition, also the oilseed industry, the MSME oilseed industry, the Kachi Ghani groups, and so on, they have been opposing GM mustard as well. There has been a whole hearing which has been going on Supreme Court over the last few weeks and months, and a decision on this and a whole lot of other GM issues is to be made soon. Same situation as with cotton. We have higher yields in mustard in countries which do not grow GM mustard as well. Now, again, there are a whole lot of other alternatives which need to be done to be able to tackle the huge import in edible oil in India. In mustard itself, there are techniques on intensification techniques. There are conservation agriculture, transplantation, intercropping, getting other varieties of mustard and hybrids which uh, provide for higher yields. Also, there are other policy measures as well. In late 80s, early 90s, we had actually become self-sufficient in edible oil, 97, 98%. However, the policies which were followed by then government to scrap yellow revolution and allow for subsidized edible oil to enter in India during the GATT and the time of WTO, that actually eventually led to the decline of our self-sufficiency in edible oil. And if you also look at scientists in terms of what they've said, they actually said to the union government, which was in 2013, to implement the Supreme Court Technical Expert Committee, which said that no herbicide tolerant GM crops such as GM mustard should be allowed to be released in India. Doctors have written to the prime minister and where they have mentioned there are a whole lot of health issues. Often this is actually painted as something that just the environmentalists, just the Luddites are the ones who are actually opposing this. Clearly, this clearly is not the case. Obviously, there are scientists who have also been saying there have been the Nobel laureates who have said that GM crops should be allowed, but clearly the verdict is divided. It is not settled matter in either India or around the world whether GM crops should be allowed or not. In countries where such herbicide tolerant crops have been allowed, we have also seen the case of weed resistance as well. There are large areas of land where such weed resistances have emerged. Super weeds, big sized weeds have emerged. A lot of areas of land have to be left fallow because the herbicides are not able to deal with the even more powerful weeds which are emerging. One gets into a whole concoction of such weedicides, but still not being able to tackle with the treadmill that this is being pushed on upon. Also, what happens often is such herbicides actually drift onto neighboring farmers. What the herbicide tolerant crop does, the GM crop, it will be able to withstand the herbicide. But the those which are not herbicide tolerant, the weeds or even the neighboring farmer crops, they would be damaged. They would be destroyed because they would not be able to deal with the weeds. So what will then happen is that the even neighboring farmers have had to move towards these crops. So this is not again a liberal situation. Agriculture does not farms do not for beekeepers as well. Mustard is a very important crop because for honeybees mustard is a very important crop. There has been a great opposition from beekeepers as well, and obviously there are a whole lot of other ecological and human health issues as well. Now, also, one must also look at the role of mustard in Indian culture as well. Obviously, mustard is something which has, been used a lot in Indian homes. But also, mustard oil has a role in Ayurveda. Shani Mandir is somewhere where mustard oil is used a lot. These traditional usages of mustard have never figured a way in terms of consideration of the regulators. Um, are people supposed to be applying GM mustard oil to Shanidev? That's what the situation will come to if GM mustard is allowed to go unchecked. And it's not just a case of what is happening, in farms, the situation as well. In food system, in foods already as well. So now we'll move slightly beyond farming. There was a study which was done in 2018 by Center for Science and Environment. And before that as well, there had been reports which had been made to FSCI. It was found that there were large scale illegal genetically modified food which is being sold to Indian consumers. There were, canola oil, which were GM positive. Obviously, the cottonseed oil, which is not legally allowed, but origin, being from India, was GM positive. Soya bean oil, when it was tested, those samples in India tested negative. But there were a whole lot of other ready to cook products, a whole lot of products which were coming from US. The canola oil which I was speaking about, that came from Canada, again illegally. There were Kellogg's products, a whole lot of other packaged food products, including products intended for infants, which were tested to be GM positive. All of it happening illegally. Now, again, it is 2018 and today is 2024. No action yet has been taken by the FSSAI, which is supposed to be the food safety regulator for India. So we have seen time and again, we have seen GAC, which sits in the Ministry of Environment. We have seen here FSSAI, which sits in the Ministry of Health. The regulators who are supposed to be protecting us from such illegal issues, constant dereliction in duty by them. Now, FSSAI did come up with a draft regulation for genetically modified food. However, that allows for up till 1% GM threshold. Anything up till that will be counted as non-GM. Whereas labs in India are able to test for GM presence until 0.01%. So the thresholds have been set 100 times weaker for GM presence. It doesn't look at what are the, is there even a need for those GM food? Are there alternatives available? It doesn't again perform the sort of tests which are missing in GAC as well. The sort of independent test, long-term test, comprehensive, rigorous test. It again also does not speak about preventing conflict of interest in regulation. Point of mentioning all of that is that we need much stronger regulation to be able to tackle illegal GM foods. And also, and with some of this as well, given there are no, these do not have any immediate necessarily health impact. Who is to even test on, given, the labeling is not done, who is to even test on what impact they would be having on humans, given obviously what we have seen on what is happening for cows and rats, if people are consuming those. There is again, as with all those years earlier in the case of BT brinjal, there is strong US pressure to weaken our GM regulation even further, and that is to allow for GM foods in US to be exported to India. Now, again, if we look at how other countries in the world are doing, often also it is also mentioned that we do not want to be a backward country, we do not want to remain behind. But if we look at it, over 170 countries in the world do not grow GM crops. It's literally 5 to 12 countries which are allowing for GM crops to be grown. There are countries like Germany, Sweden, which used to have some GM crops being grown, but do not allow for that now as well. Most of the developed countries in the world, they do not allow for GM crops as well. And just wanted to highlight beyond, now that we have looked at a bit of the history of GM and how that has come in and some of the impacts of it, I also wanted to touch on the future aspects of GM in Indian agriculture as well. There are new age GMOs, known as gene editing, which are also being allowed in India at an even weaker regulation than they were there for GM crops. Now, obviously, we have to fix the GM regulation. There is already an even weaker regulation than that being allowed in India. Now, in modification, genetic modification, what they are mentioning is that modification allows for a transgene, a foreign gene to be inserted in a GM crop. Here, they are speaking about just editing an existing gene. And which is why they are saying. But however, what has been found time and time again in a whole lot of research coming in from other countries who have been looking at this earlier, is that it is not a precise tool. They are saying that this is a precise tool. It will not have any issues. There are a whole lot of unintentional impacts. The science of genetics does not work on that. You can edit one gene and nothing will happen to the genes nearby. The omnigenics, as the science is now being started to understood, is that what you do here will have downstream impacts, will have impact somewhere upstream, which you will not be able to figure out unless you test for it. And the regulators have taken a position that 2 of the 3 gene editing categories, they would not be called GM at all. They would be allowed to come into our food systems without people even knowing that what they might be consuming might be GM. Now, there are a whole lot of other crops in India beyond mustard on GM crops, which are there in the research pipeline as well. I mean, you name it, there are fruits, there are vegetables, there are grains, everything is up for genetic modification. What we also know is that we are actually having, obviously, in addition to the food, we are also having seeds being imported in India from countries which grow GM varieties of these crops. It is quite possible that some of the illegal GM cultivation being seen in India is from such smuggled GM crops. There is one group which openly actually speaks about growing such illegal crops, and also mention about smuggling some of these crops as well. Again, they have been able to escape any attention from the investigation authorities in terms of actual action being taken. Now, again, I've already touched on upon a whole lot of this, but just worth reflecting as well. If you look at the sort of opposition which has come from various stakeholders, state governments, medical groups, oilseed industries, a section of scientists, beekeepers, the farmer groups themselves, environmentalists. Obviously, I mean, if you look at everything but the bottom, the mandis themselves, consumer groups, organic natural farming, or food groups, all of them have opposed GM crops. Now, who's to actually gain from this? That is the Purupaksh we also have to apply. And when one does that, one sees that it is actually the seed and the agrochemical industry who are to gain from this. You buy the GM seeds, and you also have to buy the agrochemicals, the fertilizers, and the pesticides, which go hand in hand with the increased need for those. We are seeing a whole lot of greater corporate control on seeds, and what we have seen in the case of cotton has led to further consolidation of corporate control as GM cotton came into being. They are the ones who are to truly to benefit out of this, and theirs is the pressure and the lobby groups which are being able to push a whole lot of these. And obviously countries like US who have to gain from being able to export their GM food crops to India. Now, people always ask, I mean, okay, fine, you mentioned a whole lot of these issues. I mean, but what is the solution? We actually have the solution in our hand as well. We have organic and natural farming techniques and methods. And obviously, what also has to be seen is that both cannot go hand in hand. We have a situation where the government is pushing organic and natural farming like never before. We also have a situation where another ministry within the government has also been allowing GM crops in a situation, in a certain manner like never before as well. As we speak right now, we have world's largest natural organic farming program taking place successfully in India, showing great results, showing comparable yields or even higher yields at lower cost, better nutrition, being able to resist tackle situations such as cyclone, large scale adoption by farmers, gradual transition, unlike the one which was seen in Sri Lanka, the civil society and government working together collaboratively to promote organic and natural farming, uh, being adopt being adopted slowly and gradually by farmers. So obviously, showing reduced water usage, showing a whole lot of savings on fertilizers in those areas, showing a reduction in electricity costs as well. What also has to be kept in mind is that organic natural farming cannot go hand in hand with GM. One of the basic definitions, one of the basic principles of these is that GM seeds cannot be allowed. And what will also happen is that you have an organic natural farm, you have a GM farm next to it, it will inevitably contaminate, or the herbicide drift, as we spoke about earlier, will impact the organic natural farm as well. Uh, and again, just to start from the point where, just to end from the point where we started, we have a whole lot of non-GM traditional varieties and other techniques which can give better nutrition and help us being able to deal with a whole lot of issues that one is starting to see in the situation of changing climatic condition. And this also brings us to the larger question as well in terms of what should our view be on development. I mean, it's just anti-development, and which is where it actually is worth referring to something Swami Nishalanand and Saraswati worked on upon, which was a book called Vikas Vimarsh. Haley Kalyan had given a very good talk on Vikas Vimarsh as well. And the gist of that talk is that our worldview on development has been that it has to be done within certain parameters and certain limits. It cannot be uncontrolled. It cannot be free for all. There have to be checks and balances which have to be applied, and something which actually fundamentally goes against nature by through its very definition. Should we be okay with that? Should we be okay with tampering genes of something which, once it goes on the field, is pretty much irreversible? It will reproduce. It will lead to downstream impacts. Uh, and which is where our scientists, doctors who are opposing GM crops, are they Luddite? Sangh has been a big opposer of GM crops as well. Are they anti-national? Often, the tag which is used to people and groups who would be opposing certain themes is where I would like to end my talk. Thank you.
The APMC still continuing because of the repealing of the 2020 um, laws. It was about the MSPs, because we have a very poor go down and storage technology in India when it comes to crops. So there is some sort of appeal which comes from GM crops because of their longer shelf life. So do you think that farmers seem to have some kind of bias because of that toward GM crops, or the government for that matter has some bias because of that?
So, in terms of the storage and shelf life related things, it is actually worth looking at what is the case situation in Andhra Pradesh, where the world's largest such program is being done, where more than 8 lakh farmers are already at various stages of the transition journey. Now, what has been seen in that, and Tirupati Devsthanam has been actually procuring for the prasadam a whole lot of ingredients from such organic natural farming farmers. What has been seen is that the shelf life has actually doubled of the prasadam compared to what it was before conventional agrochemical grown ingredients were used. So we need to ask a whole lot of these questions in terms of the increased shelf life. Where do the stories, do such news even comes from? And then be able to really verify that whether that is really the truth, or those are being conveyed from sources who are inclined to gain from pushing these crops.
Another question regarding cotton, sir, that the best raw material or the best raw cotton is to be found in India. That goes then is then exported to countries like the US, which means that the finished cotton products that Indians are able to use are of poorer quality. So this particular BT cotton, are Indians higher consumers of this, or are Americans higher consumers of
Oh,
this?
so 98 to 99% of cotton in India is genetically modified as of now, because they've destroyed the things that I was mentioning earlier, in terms of they managed to destroy a whole lot of other non-GM cotton germplasm. They've removed a whole lot of varieties away from market. The cotton that we used to have, we are far away from having. So all of that is GM right now. Having said that, there are still efforts from the very little germplasm that we still have to be able to grow non-GM organic cotton, and we are actually seeing results. There are reports and studies which are showing that non-GM cotton is able to provide for higher yield. Organic cotton is able to provide for higher yield than GM cotton, even though we have a research system which is not really inclined towards looking at organic cotton. In spite of all those challenges and the limited germplasm, we are seeing these results.
So could you tell us a little bit more about this yellow revolution that you were discussing?
So what, and this was something which was started in, the conception of that was initiated in mid 1980s. And the idea again, the situation again then as now, was to be able to deal with with the the huge oil seed edible oil import. And what the country decided to do was to be able to apply tariffs, whilst at the same time working on the production measures as well, and protect India from the subsidized oil coming from other countries. Now, these measures, and this is again, being led by Verghese Kurian at that time, and that helped India come to a situation where by late 80s, early 1990s, we were able to be self-sufficient in edible oil. So, which is where I was mentioning 97 to 98%. So a pure policy move, and obviously with the viewpoint on strengthening support to the overall edible oil, that led us to get to where we are. and which is where at that time is when the push towards GATT, WTO, World Trade Organization entry, that got a whole lot of push, and there was pressure on India to be able to reduce its tariff rates and allow for subsidized edible oil to flood our markets, and which is where and there was another issue on dropsy with argemone oil that led to another further push and deterioration of India's own production of edible oil, and the consequent issues in self-sufficiency in that.
Another question would be, sir, that usually biology students in high school are often given a very glorified picture of GM crops and the kind of positive change that agriculture can have with BT being introduced. So, why are we seeing such academic patronage of BT or genetically modified crops?
This is another great example on why our curriculum needs to be corrected. The a whole lot of the policy space and institutional space has been captured by forces which stand to benefit and gain from these. They've been able to shape the official narrative and discourse, whereas the truth has been actually in a very opposite direction on the matter of GM. But again, I mean, as they say, until lions are able to start writing their own history, the history books will actually glorify the hunter. That is what we are actually seeing in the case of GM, unfortunately, as well. Which is where, whilst the truth stands in complete opposition, they will be able to cherry pick point data of a few handful of farmers rather than looking at the entire farmer situation and the data and results. And even now they are coming to a situation where they're seeing actually there has been that failure. The solution will for that will be let's put more GM on that. Yeah, how the situation has been at our end. I'd just like to add just one more point as
Sure.
well. I mean, is the importance of GM crops and this, the danger that we are facing cannot be overstated.
Mhm.
I mean, in interest of our health, in interest of the well-being of our farmers, in interest of the well-being of the cows, in interest of the well-being of organic farming and food and the oil seed players and the beekeepers, it is critical that we are able to tackle and deal with GM crops. Otherwise, the disaster that we are seeing in other countries, we will see something like that in India as well. Namaste. Thank you.